What a thrill.
Please indulge me with a moment of reflection. I started this channel with a review of Tales of the Abyss 3D. That review is no longer available because it was not very good. Then a few years ago, I shifted my YouTubing efforts back to reviews, starting with Tales of Vesperia Definitive Edition. So for the 25-year anniversary of the series, it's only fitting that I look at Bandai Namco's latest effort, Tales of Arise. Arise is equal parts a commemoration of its predecessors and a conscious refresh for Tales. With a new combat system, a new presentation style, and as the first game since the departure of series veteran Hideo Baba, does Arise manage to ascend to the apex of this legendary series? Let's find out. But first, please subscribe and click the bell to stay notified whenever I publish new content. I upload pretty consistently, and I have other reviews already in the catalog, so check those out too. Now let's get started. This review is based on a physical retail release played on the PlayStation 5.
My name is... Alfred!
Like the majority of Tales games, Tales of Arise is a story-rich, standalone title. 300 years ago, the technologically advanced civilization of Rena laid waste to its twin world, Dana. The Danan people were enslaved and their world subjugated to 5 Renan lords. In the present day, you play as Alphen, an amnesiac from Dana who cannot feel pain, and Shion, a Renan girl with a mysterious curse known as her Thorns. Fate brings Alphen and Shion together, and they set off to take down the Renan lords and free the Danan people from centuries of oppression. Though the journey is expansive in scope, its conveyance is intimate in focus. Arise is less a story about warring factions, and more a story about the people within that war. Every Danan realm has its own culture, every Renan lord their own ideals, and the people that form your party are varied in backgrounds and ideologies. Arise paints a vivid picture with nuanced situations, and the personal framing of these narrative beats gives the story several great character moments. However, without giving anything away, one point of criticism I have with Arise is that it tends to cop out of its more interesting scenarios. Tales does a great job at setting up morally gray circumstances, but then quickly shies away from tackling these quandaries head-on. There's always an excuse to explain away a character's motivations, and I felt this often undermined what would otherwise be an engaging premise. And there are times where it shouldn't have morally gray circumstances, but elects to do so anyway to its own detriment. I imagine the root cause stems from cultural differences between Japan and the US, but I found certain details to be a bit insensitive in transition. Still, the focus on the personal journeys of Arise's characters is evident in the story structure at large. Tales' signature skits return, allowing for more in-depth party interactions. However, the format and frequency of skits have been changed. These scenes are now rendered with more stylized manga panels and utilize in-game models instead of hand-drawn art. It has its advantages and disadvantages. 3D skits admittedly lack the same bubbly charm that the 2D animations had in spades, but skits feel a lot more dynamic in 3D, which is great because you'll be viewing them more often. These scenes are more heavily intertwined with Arise's other mechanics compared to the implementation of skits in previous Tales games. Some story cutscenes still play as skits, but now side activities may also cue skits. Camping out has its own scenes, even cooking and resting each have their own accompanying interactions. This is in addition to the extraneous, non-skit, non-cutscene dialogues interwoven with various mechanics.
I got it off a street vendor for just 10 gold!
I don't know if that's something to brag about.
While new players may feel overwhelmed by the frequency, longtime fans will likely enjoy the greater emphasis on character relationships and development. So it's extra reassuring that the characters are likable. To me, Tales of Arise is a good story elevated by great moments. Maybe the skits are a bit long-winded, maybe the characters have a habit of repeating themselves at length, maybe some of the moral ambiguity wasn't dealt with as well as it could, and perhaps should, have been handled. But there were so many interactions that I felt were honest and candid, true to those characters, in those situations, at those moments in their lives, and it's those scenes that make the story better. It propels the narrative of Arise through all its highs, and carries it through its lows. But there were more high marks than not, and when the story hits, it hits flush. Time will tell how it's received in retrospect, but in the immediate aftermath, I can say I enjoyed all 50-some-odd hours I spent with Alphen and company. I'm sure you've already noticed, but Tales of Arise looks really good, better even than its direct predecessor, Tales of Berseria. Arise saw Bandai Namco switch game engines to Unreal Engine 4, and combined with the art design, it's beautiful. I was constantly stopping to take in the scenery throughout the game. Character models and animations are much higher fidelity than in past Tales games. NPCs and enemy archetypes tend to repeat fairly often, but I didn't find this to be a problem during my playthrough. Textures, shadows, and lighting are markedly improved across the board, especially the lighting. It's a huge step up from what was previously seen in the proprietary Tales engine. And the particle effects are heavily utilized throughout the game to great effect, especially in the late-game combat encounters. It's worth noting that Arise features many of the same graphical quirks found in other Unreal Engine 4 games. You can still easily see the boundary of the high-quality texture render. There's noticeable draw distance related pop-in, and some faraway objects in Arise tend to have reduced frame rates. Additionally, Arise has no HDR support any which way, which is a bit disappointing. PlayStation 5 Performance Mode runs at an upscaled 4K 60 and stays locked at 60 frames per second. Graphics Mode runs at a native 4K with an uncapped target 60 FPS. However, Graphics Mode rarely hits 60, if ever, instead hovering in the range of 40 to 50 frames per second pretty much at all times. It's definitely still playable, more than playable actually, but if you normally run games in 60 FPS like I do, then Graphics Mode will have a small but noticeable amount of latency. Here's a side-by-side of me just running around in each mode for comparison. As a frame rate first kind of guy, I opted to play in Performance Mode, which is still gorgeously rendered at 1640p. Time to do some visual comparisons. This time we're going to start with Graphics Mode. Of course, the native 4K looks great, though I find the frame rate-induced latency to be quite noticeable. Maybe it's more of a feeling than a visual experience, but I'll let this ride for a bit to hopefully show what I mean. Now here's Performance Mode. This is much smoother overall. It does sacrifice in its pure visual fidelity, but the greater, steadier frame rate makes it more than a fair trade, in my opinion. Before I move on though, let's dig into Tales some more. Since Arise marks a deliberate refresh for the series, I want to take a look back at Tales past and see how far we've come. So what better place to begin than with my first ever review subject, Tales of the Abyss. This is the PlayStation 2 version, and my personal entry point to the series. As such, it holds some nostalgic favoritism for me. This footage was captured using HD Retrovision component cables fed through an analog to digital signal converter, not an upscaler. I wanted to show an accurate Abyss experience with the limitations of the era. Even so, since this is through component out, it might look better than you remember. Truth be told, I'm still impressed with Abyss today, some 15 years removed from its initial release. I think it's held up remarkably well, and the character animation is highly emotive. I wish they continued with this style in the later entries. Let's take a half step forward with Tales of Symphonia, originally released on GameCube but later ported to PlayStation 3, which is what I'm showing now. I thought this would be an interesting stopgap because Symphonia is older than Abyss, but available on newer hardware, and it's also a lot of people's nostalgic favorite. You can definitely tell it's an older game. The models and animations aren't as fluent as its successors. But the move to HD did wonders for Symphonia, and it really lets the art design sit front and center. Here's Tales of Grace's F, another interesting stopgap. This was originally a Nintendo Wii game exclusively released in Japan, but then it was up-ported and localized for the PlayStation 3. There's a lot of great stuff here, and I like the boldness of the character art. There's some changes in world design and game layout, but not to the same extent as Arise. The characters themselves visually remind me of that mid-2000s era anime. You know, that period of anime where everybody was just fucking long? Which I guess is fitting because there was a Japanese exclusive crossover with Code Geass and Grace's F. Maybe it's a bit eccentric, but I still like this entry, and I think Grace's F's visuals hold up quite well. Time to talk Tales of Vesperia. I'm showing off the definitive edition on Nintendo Switch here. This release is the most recent console Tales game of any kind besides Arise. Objectively speaking, the original Vesperia came out before Tales of Graces, but Vesperia was designed specifically for more powerful hardware, so it has a few technical advantages. I don't want to dive too far into Vesperia because I've previously reviewed it, but I think this game is fantastic. Still, at this point, you can feel that Tales is starting to show its age, and the less colorful animations make Vesperia come off a bit stiff. Nevertheless, a great game and another nostalgic favorite for a lot of people. That brings us to Tales of Berseria on PS4, the most recent original Tales game on consoles, not including Arise. I remember liking this visual style quite a bit when it first came out. Today, it kinda reminds me of the more recent Falcom games. A lot of work was put into making the character models better, but the surrounding objects and a lot of the textures are much more basic and flat-looking. Berseria is also held back by being on the PS3 and PS4. For instance, there are no 4K features at all on PS4, upscaled or otherwise. This is a purely 1080p experience. But the game still feels a lot fresher than its predecessors from a graphical and animation perspective, thanks to some smart design choices. And of course, the star of the show, Tales of Arise. A fantastic leap forward, and from a purely technical standpoint, it's the best the series has ever looked. Arise is much more lush, with a significantly more robust color palette and more fluid animations. Again, I'll miss the sprightly appeal of the old 2D skits and the deliberately outlandish 3D animations of past titles. But Arise nails its visual presentation and maintains a certain charm of its own. I obviously think quite highly of Arise's graphics, and this presentation style bodes well for the future of the series. We've come quite a ways from the unvoiced 2D talking heads of the past. Speaking of talking, the voice acting in Arise is pretty good. After all, you can't have a heartfelt character moment if the performance is bad, so the cast had to deliver. There are a few minor characters that come across a bit flat in either language, and I did notice a few discrepancies between the spoken dialogue and the written subtitles. But it didn't distract from the experience, and the pivotal characters are elevated by great acting in both English and Japanese.
さてと、これでいい。傷が開かんよう、しばらくはおとなしくしとけ。
ドク、あんたは何もわからない俺に、ここでの暮らし方を教えてくれた。それは感謝している。だけど俺は。
そう焦るな。少なくともお前はわしより若い。時節を待て。自分のことも世の中のこともだ。
There. That should just about do it. Now, do me a favor and try to stay out of trouble so the wound doesn't open again.
Doc, back when I knew nothing, you were the one who taught me just how things work around here. You know I'll always be grateful for that, but I can't just...
The race is won by the calm and the steady. You're still young, you have time. Wait for the right moment, both for yourself and the world.
Personally, I decided to play Tales of Arise in English because I played past Tales games in English. As for the music, series composer Motoi Sakuraba returns to score Arise, and his work here fits right in with the rest of his impressive resume. Some may find the soundtrack to be a bit too uniform with the music of Tales past, but it still sounds good regardless. And that leaves us with the gameplay in Arise. Alongside the visuals, Arise's mechanical functions are perhaps the most thoroughly overhauled aspect. Let's start with exploration. Unlike many past Tales games, Arise does not feature an open-world map. Instead, the layout is broken up into several zones, most of which are linear passageways and all of which are very direct. There are a few open-ish areas with a handful of branching paths, but the end design still ultimately funnels the player towards the next narrative beat. Circle serves as a dedicated jump button, which is a welcome addition, and you can either hold R2 or click the left stick to run. I don't really mind this more linear layout thanks to the aforementioned open areas, and I don't think I miss the endless green fields of nothing happening seen in past titles. Plus, there's some backtracking side quests and a fast travel system that makes progression feel less like a series of hallways. It at least feels more open than something like Final Fantasy XIII. However, I do wish that the open areas were either more plentiful or expansive, ideally both, as this would further incentivize exploration. In its present state, the world of Dana feels rather small, smaller even than Final Fantasy XII, a game originally designed for PS2 that uses similar interconnected zones but boasts larger individual areas. Battles in Arise still take place in separate arenas rather than directly on the overworld map, and combat itself has been reimagined with much more liberating movement mechanics. Gone is the linear motion battle system that necessitated additive functions like free run as pioneered by Tales of the Abyss. Instead, Tales of Arise is a silky smooth, free-flowing action JRPG, reworking the style and presentation of Berseria's combat to a new end goal. Fighting is a significantly faster affair in Arise. Basic attack is mapped to R1, while the X, square, and triangle buttons each perform manually assigned arts. Circle is still jump, which helps when dealing with any pesky airborne enemies. R2 performs a dodge, and dodging at the last second engages a short bullet time segment for counterattacking, similar to flash dodging in the East series. By dodging and landing combos, you'll gradually fill up each character's boost gauge in the bottom left corner. Once any of the meters is full, you can push the corresponding directional input to perform that party member's boost attack. These special solo abilities deal greater damage and may potentially knock enemies down, interrupting their attack cycles and allowing for some free hits. There's also a meter surrounding the targeting icon, and once that meter is full, you can push any button on the D-pad to perform a boost strike tandem finisher. These team-up super attacks are really quick, but they pack a literal barrage of visual flair and effects into just a few short seconds. It never gets old, and more importantly, boost animations of any kind do not interrupt the flow of combat because they're so fast-paced, which keeps everything moving at the same breakneck speed. Over-limits make their return functioning largely the same. The more damage you take, the more perfect dodges you perform, the more likely it is to enable over-limit. Once active, the character will enter a limited enhanced state where they can repeatedly use arts without depleting their arts gauge. If you press and hold two different arts buttons at the same time during an over-limit, the character will then perform a Mystic Art ultimate attack. Again, these animations are kept short so as to preserve the tempo of engagements. There are some balancing problems though. Notably, the healing mechanics are a bit stingy. Anytime anyone in the party performs a healing art, it uses cure points. Cure points are also used to bypass certain environmental barriers. Managing your cure point reserve becomes trickier as you progress through the game, usually because of the increasing cost of dispersing obstacles. This makes the entire curative system feel somewhat player hostile, especially in the later sections of the game. And then there are the bosses. Bosses and sub-bosses are far too spongy for their own good, and it makes their battles less fun. It's pretty agitating when you've already seen all of a boss's attack phases, but you're still wailing away to try to break down their health meters or shatter their weak points. Boss battles are slower, more methodical, and thus more plotting, and they stand in stark contrast with the high-intensity encounters seen throughout the rest of the game. But I think the gameplay in Arise is generally very strong. I had a lot of fun entering combat, waylaying opponents with arts and boosts, and then continuing on my merry way. There are a few different side activities like running a ranch and fishing, and the world is littered with special, more powerful monsters for you to take down. Aside from the admittedly minor but still annoying balancing issues, I have nothing but good things to say about the gameplay. But is Arise the best Tales game? That depends on your perspective. I'd say it has one of the better Tales stories. I can definitely see the fingerprints from Symphonia and Abyss on Arise's narrative blueprint. You can also make a pretty good argument for Arise having the best cast of characters. To me, Alphen and company are at least in the same conversation as the characters from Abyss and Vesperia. And Arise definitely has the best gameplay in the series, bar none. Maybe my nostalgia says no, but I don't think I would argue with anyone that says Arise is the best. Regardless, it's undeniable that Bandai Namco has a solid foundation from which to launch all tales yet to come. And if you're new to the series, well, there's never been a more inviting time to start than right now. Tales of Arise on PlayStation 5 earns a 9 out of 10. Thanks for watching. I know it was a long video, but I wanted to do justice not just to this game, but to the series at large. If you liked the video, please subscribe, click the bell, and check out my other content on screen. Thanks.